yelling and screaming united. She kept pleading incessantly with her lips. The body seemed to be reaching out to touch her, perhaps to catch hold of her legs. The girl sobbed and pleaded once again. Nonetheless, nobody appeared to care. Her forehead was wet with sweat. Her eyes were shut and her hands were swaying to the left and right as if to ward off an oncoming threat. With her eyes closed, she continued to sob and grovel. The girl's ranting nightmare was interrupted by a woman in a white uniform who embraced her passionately. The woman gave the girl a shot of sobriety in the hopes that it would help her. Rape victims, trauma. She must be having nightmares again. The woman in the white uniform thought to herself while hugging the girl. His eyes were far staring out the window, like finding hope in life. The exterior looks healthy and fine, but in his small body, it is spreading deadly viruses from organ to organ. He was once confirmed to be healthy and had nothing to worry about, but now he is being flown to this ward due to liver problems and cancer that is starting to spread. From Sarawak to Kuala Lumpur, far off. Far away, he pondered, perhaps counting the days to enjoy the outside world, vacationing with family, playing with friends at school, living a normal life like no other. His mother, who had just arrived, immediately put the food on the table and got his dreamy son away who was sitting in his wheelchair. His mother greeted and turned his wheelchair to face herself and hugged the child who was apparently crying in silence. The mother's heart sank when she saw a child who continues to struggle with his pain. Then, both wept in remembrance of the test sent by God. His eyes slowly opened, kept an eye on what was going on. The distant sound of beeping is getting tedious. As seen by the wrappings on his head, left hand and left leg, it can be known that he has been sent to the hospital. A woman in a blue scarf, her head resting in the corner of the bed, can be seen at the end of his right hand. He started to think back on what had gotten him there. After a late afternoon math lesson, he headed straight for his motorcycle. Since he hadn't had time to eat before his extra class, he was eager to go back to his house as soon as possible. On his way home, he was rear-ended by another car, which caused him to lose control of his motorcycle. He then collided head-on with a moving sand lorry, which resulted in his motor colliding with the back of the lorry. His look was dreary and covered in obscurity. He began to make a little movement because he had been in lying position for too long without movement. His movements kept the woman in the blue scarf awake.
Razik! Ya Allah! Razik is awake! Ya Allah! My poor son!
The mood turned melancholy and tearful when the woman in the blue scarf woke up and immediately called the doctor and nurse in a cry of thanksgiving. Mrs. Inderjeet? Call a nurse.
Yes? Is it possible to get in now?
Sure, you can come in and start it. Mrs. Inderjeet, an elderly teacher, approached one of the beds in the ward to begin her teaching. Like other days, she is always enthusiastic, or arguably, since teaching at this hospital, she will make sure that she has double spirit and energy, one for herself and the other for the patient who is her pupil. There are various stories behind each patient who are her pupils in this hospital. However, this new experience has never turned off her passion for teaching and educating these children who are being tested, even though they are of different religions, races, and beliefs. They are like dreary gems, and the gems need to be polished. Prior to applying and volunteering to teach at the hospital, she, who was very experienced in teaching and educating, was given a golden opportunity twice to evaluate manuscripts and assist writers of textbooks. She had been an educator for 33 years when she finally tried to apply to teach at the hospital and had her application accepted. She was placed in Hospital Serdang to teach patients who are still in school, but displaced due to illness and so on.
Okay, learning time is almost over. How do you feel today, Alana? Do you feel great?
Asked Mrs. Inderjeet, full of care and affection. Before you came earlier, my stomach felt bloated. I was worried that I won't be able to keep learning today, but I'm trying to get a grip because I really want to see you. I like to study with you again. I'm glad to see you again today.
What about today's homework? Is it too difficult? If you can't solve it, tomorrow we will do it together. But I want you to try first, okay?
Said Mrs. Inderjeet. Alana smiled, shook her head, and waved at the English teacher until it went out of sight. The nurse smiled at Mrs. Inderjeet and showed her to the next bed where the next teaching and learning session would take place. That morning, Mrs. Inderjeet stepped into the hospital, and as usual, she greeted the hospital staff. She listed a few songs for the lesson that day. She would teach a girl who could only talk and move her head, which means she was bedridden.
How are you today, my dear?
Greeted Mrs. Inderjeet. Oh, good and exciting! Exclaimed the girl cheerfully.
Today, I've provided you with a few songs. After listening to all those songs, I want you to extract positive things from those songs.
Explained Mrs. Inderjeet to Aisha. Aisha nodded to show that she was ready. The song was played several times, and Aisha listened to all of them with her eyes that seemed to flash sparkles of hopes. Beautiful by Christina Aguilera makes me feel like I'm a smart, beautiful girl. Even though I can't move and do activities like normal kids, I believe I'm blessed with a smart brain because I'm still able to learn and think, said Aisha with enthusiasm and a radiant smile that never fades from her lips. With a mixed feeling of sorrow and grief, Mrs. Inderjeet braced up Aisha by saying,
You are right, my dear. Never feel inferior no matter what test comes your way.
The song We Are the Champions by Queen taught me that I have to withstand these challenges and cannot stop fighting until I succeed. I have listened to all these songs and I treasure the values, teacher. Aisha commented on the second song.
Absolutely, my dear. Whatever comes to us, whatever we've done, good or bad, face it, fix it, and never stop moving forward because there's no time for losers in this life.
Mrs. Inderjeet explained in more detail. Aisha nodded while beaming a genial smile to Mrs. Inderjeet. Before they call it a day, Aisha spoke again. I like you. I like English. Although my English is not very good, I would like to communicate in English with you. With my condition, which I unable to move and the pain throbbing from the inside, I knew I might not be able to last long. Thank you, teacher, for teaching me. I love you, teacher. Tomorrow you will come again, right? I want to hear you read me a poem. Aisha asked cheerfully. With a crestfallen feeling, Mrs. Inderjeet managed to give a smile and nodded her head. She was fond of this child. The girl was passionate about English subject, mainly in literature components like poems. The nurse helped Mrs. Inderjeet put on a plastic gown and gloves that covered her before passing into the isolation ward that accommodated her students for that morning's learning session.
Good morning and hi, Aaron. How are you feeling today?
Asked Mrs. Inderjeet generously.
Good morning, teacher. Today is not as good as yesterday.
Replied Aaron with narrow, red-rimmed eyes.
And why is that so, Aaron?
She befuddled.
I couldn't sleep well last night. The whole skin on my body was so itchy that I cried, and there were several spots bleeding.
Aaron replied sadly as his hand began to scratch several itchy spots on his body.
I'm sorry, teacher. I cannot focus for today. The doctor gave an injection, but after a few hours of the injection period, I feel itchy again.
I understand. Don't worry about it. I will update your current situation with the nurse for further action. Even the doctor informed me of your condition before I came in here this morning. I'm just here to ask how you are because I haven't seen you in person all week.
Mrs. Inderjeet explained to Aaron.
My apologies, teacher. I didn't mean to trouble you.
With a silent face, Aaron apologized.
Don't worry, Aaron. I wish you a speedy recovery.
Replied Mrs. Inderjeet before walking away with a prayer of hope for Aaron.
And for that, the government decided to implement the Movement Control Order from March 18, 2020, which is the day after tomorrow, until March 31st, 2020, throughout the country.
A stupefaction news from the Prime Minister came out like a bombshell to all. This is due to COVID-19 outbreak around the world,
What about the students at the hospital?
said Mrs. Inderjeet. During the period of the movement control order, the patients who are her students would attend online classes together with their previous school teachers. This is because there are no face-to-face meetings and learning at school. Therefore, teachers have to meet and teach students online. Thus, the patients who are Mrs. Inderjeet's students will also go back to school with their classmates online. No physical meeting at the moment for Mrs. Inderjeet and her students. Throughout the period of the movement control order, teachers who are on duty at the hospital still need to follow the programs and activities that have been prepared online. They will follow each activity and program through Google Meet. However, when there are patients from school who are admitted to the hospital and need to be warded for a long period of time, the teachers will return to the hospital and teach if the student's condition is good and fit enough to continue the learning session. Mrs. Inderjeet, this patient has been in the hospital for 4 days. His condition is still not healthy. However, you can see the condition of the patient first. If the patient is still weak, you don't have to continue, okay? Explained the doctor to Mrs. Inderjeet politely before walking away. Mrs. Inderjeet stepped into the ward where her student was suffering from dengue.
Good morning, Chiong. How are you today?
Asked Mrs. Inderjeet with full motherly nature.
Good morning, teacher. I'm better than yesterday, but my head still hurts and throbs. I'm not fit to get up and sit for long periods of time, teacher.
Chiong explained laboriously.
Oh, it's okay, Chiong. I came to visit and see how you are. I hope you get enough rest and get well soon.
Mrs. Inderjeet prayed with a smile before walking out of the room. The next day, Mrs. Inderjeet was able to continue the teaching and learning session with Chiong for a period of 40 minutes. During that period, Mrs. Inderjeet also gave away to a doctor who made a visit to check on Chiong's condition. After several months of MCO, the Malaysian Ministry of Education finally decided that all the teachers who were on duty at the hospital should return to school. With this, Mrs. Inderjeet was placed in one of the schools near her. Mrs. Inderjeet was finally able to experience teaching online after receiving the new teaching timetable. Various situations faced by her. Some are interesting and some are the opposite. Among them, first, internet connection and technical aspect.
Can you all hear me?
Mrs. Inderjeet asked the students on her screen. No response. The students are ready to wait in front of their respective computer or phone screens.
Can you all hear me?
Mrs. Inderjeet asked again, raising her voice a little in hopes they could hear her. A message notification on Google Meet comes in. We can't hear your voice, teacher. The sound of the message. Alice. Sometimes Mrs. Inderjeet could not hear the voice and response from her students as well. Dead end. There are times when classes can be run well, and there are times when classes cannot be run as planned due to speakers and mics not working well, unstable internet connections, and lack of skills to explore various types of applications and websites. Second, parents and administrators.
For that question earlier, I want Ame to answer it. Ame, what is the answer?
Asked Mrs. Inderjeet.
Ame? Ame?
Ame, why don't you answer the teacher's question? I've shown the answer, right? Please say it. Angry. Maybe it was Amir's mother's voice and the mic forgot to turn it off so that everyone in the class could hear it. Oh my God. This has not yet been added to the presence of administrators in the Google Meet classes to ensure that teachers teach according to their respective schedules. This situation to some extent puts pressure on the teachers to ensure the survival of online classes, even though most of the teachers understand that the administrators are only doing their job. Third, attendance and attitude.
Where are Richard, Joanna, and Farid? This week, they did not join my class. What has happened? Does anyone know?
Mrs. Inderjeet asked firmly, but there was a little worry in her heart. Farid has no data, teacher. He said his father was laid off earlier this month. Joanne and Richard are the same, teacher. They have no internet data. The students responded to Mrs. Inderjeet's question during their meeting on Google Meet.
Please answer question number 2, Arman.
No response.
Arman? Arman?
Arman leaves the meeting.
I always remind you, in every class, turn on your video. And if you want to ask or need to answer a question, turn on your mic.
Mrs. Inderjeet reminded her pupils every time their Google Meet session started. Fourth, YouTube and live worksheet.
It's actually easy to teach and learn online. All materials from the internet can be shown directly to students easily.
Mrs. Inderjeet said, Yeah, that's right, Mrs. Inderjeet. We don't need to bring and set up a projector and laptop like in a physical class, right? Materials from the internet can be transmitted directly to students by simply sharing the screen. I always use YouTube videos as one of my teaching aids. And the students are also amused. Answered Mrs. Sarah, Mrs. Inderjeet colleagues.
For their exercises, there are too many websites and applications that can be used. We just set up and look for questions that match to the topic of the day, then give the link to the students. They will answer it and marks will be given automatically. Very convenient. It's just that I'm not a technology person, so I'm only good at using live worksheet,
said Mrs. Inderjeet with a small laugh. Oh yeah, same here. Apart from live worksheet, Mrs. Inderjeet may try quizzes, Lookit, Kahoot, and Wordwall. There are interesting websites for the students because students can answer the questions while playing. Mrs. Sarah suggested.
They sound great. Thank you, Sarah, for suggesting it.
Mrs. Inderjeet replied happily. That's it. The world changed overnight. Every layer of society is forced to change and get out of its comfort zone. Teachers, students, and parents need to adapt to the new world of teaching and learning. In the constraints faced by all, there is certainly room to continue learning. For all. School is back in operation again, but this time, various standards operating procedures need to be followed. The SOP takes place from the moment the student arrives at school, while at school, until the student is about to return from school. It can be said that the teacher's workload has also doubled. Every day, teachers need to take and record the temperature of the students who come and return from school, take food orders every day, sanitize the classroom before the class starts and after the students return. The students are also divided into two groups, A and B. For a situation like this, Mrs. Inderjeet strongly supports the government's efforts. This is because students who drop out during home teaching and learning, which is PDPR, due to the lack of devices and data, these students can be given the appropriate focus. With the number of students that have been reduced in a class, teachers can focus on these students who have dropped out. However, at the beginning of the reopening of the school, the attendance of students at school was still not encouraging as parents did not dare to let their children go to a public place, for example, school, for a long period of time. For that reason, teachers cannot carry out classroom assessment, which is PBD. This issue has been extended by Mrs. Inderjeet to the counsellor and school administrator for further action in her school. Although the school has reopened, this does not mean that Mrs. Inderjeet has stopped the interesting learning that she has been doing throughout the last PDPR. She still integrates technology in her teaching by bringing and using laptop and projector in class. However, the bright classroom atmosphere of the new SOP deck that does not allow the installation of curtains has caused difficulties for students to see the display from the projector. Mrs. Inderjeet took her students to one of the rooms in her school library. Unfortunately, the size of the room was too small to accommodate the number of students there. Her school is also not equipped with strong internet access. Therefore, she will download all the materials in the form of videos and pictures before the teaching session. Being a teacher in this era is not easy, according to Mrs. Inderjeet. Every aspect must have its challenges. Students who drop out, students who fall behind, students who are slow, these are our students too. They have the right to be taught and educated properly. Her message again, as teachers, we need to provide equal treatment to all our students. Whatever the challenge, we have to try to give 100% of our efforts to the students. Try in various ways so that the students feel happy and attached to our teaching. We also need to realize that not all students are born with the same intelligence. They have different intelligence. Therefore, we as teachers need to help these students to balance between academics and co-curricular activities. Help them shine bright. They will bloom in their field when the right time comes. Help them with the spirit of real educators. Aisha's mother slowly approached Mrs. Inderjeet, who was writing something in her book. Mrs. Inderjeet? Aisha's mother called Mrs. Inderjeet.
Yes?
Replied Mrs. Inderjeet. I am Aisha's mother. I want to tell you, Aisha has passed away. She managed to leave a message for you that she really likes you and your English subject. Thank you. Thank you for teaching her, teacher. With tears in her eyes, Aisha's mother delivered the sad news. Mrs. Inderjeet was silent for a few seconds before pulling both of Aisha's mother's hands and stroking them gently.
My condolences to you and your family. I was really surprised. May she rest in peace in heaven.
Tears slowly fell when Mrs. Inderjeet said her words. A fallen gem. May your God bless your fighter's soul, my dear gem. We are the gems that shine with our own light. Polish the gem that is in us and shine bright while we can, before that time comes and the race will dim.